The next session is on the theme 1857. Join us for a captivating panel discussion on the theme 1857, a pivotal year in India's history. Our panelists, Dr. Rosie Llewellyn-Jones and Rana Safvi, have meticulously explored the events and stories surrounding the Indian Rebellion of 1857 through their insightful books. Moderated by Professor Amar, an expert on colonial history, this discussion promises to unravel the complexities, emotions, and historical significance of the uprising. Gain a deeper understanding of this watershed moment that shaped India's path to independence. Don't miss this opportunity to engage with our distinguished panel and delve into the pages of history. I request the panelists to come up on the stage. Dr. Rosie Llewellyn and Rana Safvi.
Session on 1857, and we have two very distinguished scholars who have worked very extensively on 1857, on the 19th century, on British India. Rosie Llewellyn-Jones Sahiba has written so extensively. Her knowledge of Lucknow is encyclopedic. But she has recently also published another book, Empire Building, which looks at construction, buildings, and so on. And the book we will be talking about is about about Lucknow in 1857, and Rana Safvi Sahiba again has written very extensively on the 19th century, on 1857, and perhaps we'll talk about some of her other writings as well. And I think it's appropriate that we have a panel which focuses on two important theaters of the conflict during 1857, Lucknow and Delhi. Delhi, the uprising took place earlier than at Lucknow. It began in as the soldiers marched from Meerut to Delhi, middle of May 1857. Delhi was under the rebels for nearly 4 months. A couple of days over 4 months, and by the middle of September, the British had managed to recapture the city. Lucknow, things started a little later in the events began to unfold in June, and then eventually the siege of the Residency, which brought the entire city under the control of the rebels by July. And this is indeed an epic siege. It lasted from July 1857 to March 1858. It's only by in March 1858 that the British were able to recapture the city. So these remain important moments, and the series of which the Lucknow book is a part is actually has also a book on Delhi as well as on Kanpur. Kanpur was actually very short-lived, very intense, but very short-lived. Things were already over by the middle of July 1857, and Kanpur remained, in fact, an important base for the operations against to recapture Lucknow. So perhaps we'll begin. We'll request Llewellyn-Jones Sahiba to understand some things that were happening at Lucknow and what made this the resistance so formidable in Lucknow.
Thank you very much, sir. May I have the book? Thank you. We have to thank Squadron Leader Rana Chinna for this book. There he is. And for the other books that are going to appear in the series. He can explain it much better than I, but I will say briefly that the idea is to look at 6 of India's most significant battles. I'm very lucky that my book was the first to be published, and the second is about Kanpur, and that's by a colleague of mine, Andrew Ward. And other books in the series will be on Delhi by Rana himself, and on Meerut, I think Amit Pathak is doing that, Kohima, and there's one more battle. So this came out last year, and it's been very well reviewed. I was delighted when Rana asked me to do this book, because although I know Lucknow very well from an architectural point of view, a social point of view, particularly during the Nawabi period, which has always fascinated me, this was the first time I had to look at the city from a military point of view. And I'm not a military historian, I don't claim to be, so I had to go and see a retired brigadier in Surrey, and he filled me in on armaments of the period, explained what a howitzer was, and that kind of thing. So this is written more or less with the architecture still in mind, but obviously looking at it from a military point of view. As Professor Farooqui said, it was highly significant, but for possibly different reasons. Now, people in Lucknow would claim that had a letter not been discovered at the beginning of May, Lucknow would in fact have been the first place where the uprising took place. There was a plot to kill British officers in their cantonment, which was quite a long way north of the city. It was 4 miles outside the city. The plot was discovered. The people who were going to kill the officers were actually hanged outside the Machi Bhavan, the old fort, and Lawrence awarded the people who'd tipped him off with robes and money, quite substantial amounts of money. But it did mean, of course, that it was at Meerut on the 10th of May that the uprising formally took place. One thing I did find was that the Battle of Chinhut, which actually precipitated the siege of the Residency, has been very much played down, and it's been overshadowed by later events. But in fact, it was very, very significant. Sir Henry Lawrence got wind that the uprising was going to start quite a long way along the Faizabad Road, about 18 miles to the east of Lucknow at Chinhut. Unfortunately, when he got news that people were massing there and prepared to march on Lucknow, he hesitated for 24 hours, and that was a fairly fatal hesitation, because that meant that more people could gather, more people who were prepared to oppose the British. So he marched out at the end of June towards Chinhut, and at first it seemed to go fairly well. There was no opposition at all. And the British troops were marching out, and they were along a raised escarpment, a bund, if you like. So they were quite clearly visible from both sides. They were silhouetted, if you like, against the skyline. And suddenly all hell broke loose, and they were bombarded from both sides, from the village of Chinhut and the village of Ismail Ganj too. Over 1,000 soldiers were killed, both British and Indian, and everything went wrong. The elephants panicked, the guns were let loose from their limbers, people were killed, and the troops, those that remained, limped back to the British Residency. 8 hours, June. You can imagine the heat of the sun. And it was really that defeat of the British at Chinhut that inspired the opposition to besiege the Residency, and the siege started that same night. Because the waters of the River Gumpti were low at the time, it meant that people could cross quite freely. So the British, under Sir Henry Lawrence, just find themselves back absolutely exhausted and their forces decimated, and they're immediately besieged with gunfire surrounding the residency. So that gives you some idea of the beginning of the siege, which, as Professor Farooqui said, lasted for 4.5 months. There was an attempt to relieve the siege on the 25th of September by General Havelock and his troops. In fact, though they managed to fight their way into the residency, they were too weak to fight their way out again. So that had to wait until November, the 15th, 16th and 17th of November, when Outram came in and was able to extract those who were left in the residency. Originally, in July, approximately 3,000 people had taken refuge in the residency. And for those of you who don't know Lucknow, this is a huge site. We're not talking about one building. We're talking about a very, very large area, 33 acres or such, about 3,000 people in this complex. About half of them died or fled. They're a mixed bunch, not only the British with their women and children, a considerable number of Anglo-Indians who'd aligned themselves with the British and thought they would be safer in the residency, and a number of Indian servants who remained loyal to their British masters, and a number of Indian troops. And over the course of the siege, quite a large number of people managed to get out. They thought they would be safer outside. So we're looking in mid-November at about evacuating 1,500 people. And this was done, they wended their way south until they were able to get onto the Cawnpore Road. They were evacuated to Cawnpore and eventually to Calcutta. So what happened? Well, Sir James Outram managed to hold an outpost to the south of the city, Alemberg, and he held on to this despite a number of attacks by Begum Hazrat Mahal and her troops. And this acted as a kind of outpost, and it meant, because Cawnpore had actually been relieved, that troops and supplies could be brought in along the Cawnpore Road to Alemberg. So when the relief of Lucknow, if you want to call it a relief, began in March 1858, there was a very sizable number of troops ready at the Alemberg. And the trick was not to go straight up into the city, as had been done in September, which caused huge loss of life, but to make a very wide circuit round to the east, almost as far as Chinhut, and then to come into Lucknow. And you were right that there was immense resistance from the people of Lucknow itself. We've got photographs of these enormous embankments, the bunds that were put up around the city in an attempt to keep the British away. Moats were dug. Every kind of defense against the British was carried out. Unfortunately, what the inhabitants of Lucknow didn't actually take on board was that the British weapons had a tremendously far range. So Campbell was able to come into the north bank of the Gumti and fire directly into the city on the south bank. And it's probably about 7 or 8 years ago that when Hazratganj, Lucknow's main street, was being dug up, an enormous British cannonball was found in front of the September Imambar. It was dug up with great excitement, and that shows the range of weaponry. And it was ultimately this that defeated the people of Lucknow, but it did take a good 2 weeks before they were vanquished, and tremendous battles went on. Begum Hazrat Mahal, she hung on in the Kaiserbagh Palace until the very last minute, until the troops were actually almost outside her door, and then she fled. She fled to Musabag, and eventually, after a couple of years, she made her way to Nepal. So it is an epic struggle, and even though the British did succeed in recapturing Lucknow, I think the people of Lucknow still have an awful lot to be proud about.
Overview of the significant moments in that very long conflict which went on for several months. And I think, it's a very difficult thing to encapsulate that within the space of just, 7 or 10 minutes, which Lieutenant Jones Sahiba has managed to do to help us to understand what was going on in Lucknow. Now, we move to Delhi, and we'll come back, of course, to Lucknow. But again, Delhi things unfolded a little earlier than at Lucknow, and the entire sort of struggle was over by the middle of September, when the first sort of attempt to evacuate the residency took place almost simultaneously. But the book that we'll request Rana Safvi Sahiba to talk about is her latest publication. Again, she's a very prolific writer, and this particular book is a book which looks at things that happened in Delhi after Delhi had been recaptured. So the focus is on women of the royal family, Begmat ke Aansu, tears of the Begums. So what happened to them after the city had been recaptured? And I think, it's a very, very sad, very tragic story. If I might just sort of briefly mention that, this book, this Begmat ke Aansu, or Tears of the Begum, is a text which was published during the 1920s as part of an attempt to provide what one might call alternative sources to an understanding of 1857, given the fact that there was so much in the public domain which was from the perspective of the colonial state. So, to present something which was a very different kind of view, a very prominent journalist, a very prominent writer, Sufi, associated with Delhi, Khwaja Hasan Nizami, of the shrine of Hazrat Nizamuddin. He put together several sort of sources and published a series of which this forms a part. And this was extremely valuable at that time also for presenting a slightly different kind of understanding of 1857. So we'll request Rana Safvi Sahiba to say something about the book.
So as Professor Farooqui mentioned, this is a very valuable source for what happened post 1857, because we have many accounts from the British historians of what happened during the siege of Delhi. But this is one of the few books that talks of what happened to the people after the fall of Delhi. Now, another book that I had also translated is Dastan-e-Ghadar, which talks of the happenings inside Shahjahanabad, or what is known as Old Delhi, during the uprising, and then how he had to flee and all the various places that he had to go to before he could come back, got a pardon and came back to Delhi. So I had a bit of an inkling of what had happened to the residents of Delhi from that book. During COVID, I started translating this book, and fortunate happenstance that this book was published last year in 2022, when it was the 100th year of its publication. And the Urdu version had been printed by about 18 times by 1946. It had been 18 reprints, and it had been published in 13 regional languages. But for some reason, it was never published in English. And I think post independence, priorities changed. People were more concerned about nation building, and 1857 somehow or the other took a back seat. So this book, when I was translating during COVID, the sense I got from that book, of course, is that life is ephemeral. Your journey here is very transitory, and why are we hanging on to things which may or may not have any meaning? And COVID, as you all know, was a very tragic phase for all of us. We lost a lot of relatives, friends, etc. And daily there would be such news. And at the same time, I was translating this. And so I think I was more, sensitized to the troubles that were being described here. Now, some of them I corroborated with the mutiny papers. Like there's a story of Kulsum Zamani Begum, who was the daughter of Badshah Bahadur Shah Zafar. And she, in the end, she talks about a pension that has been given to her. And I found these pension papers in the Delhi State Archives, that she was given a pension of 10 rupees. There are some more papers that a pension of 3 rupees to a prince called Bakhtawar Khan. So these, at the time when the Delhi Darbar was being held, we have a very famous book by Ahmad Ali. It's, of course, not a non-fiction book, but where he talks about a prince who is dragging through the city, who is dragging himself through the city on one of those beggars' carts. And when I translated Tears of the Begum, I realized that the king, the prince that he's talking about is Nasirul Mulk, who's the grandson of the Bahadur Shah Zafar. So various books that I had read, it fell into place when I was translating this, and I could provide notes. And on 14th of September, the British forces enter the old city of Delhi, that is the walled city of Shah Jahanabad, and then starts a period of punishing them for the various casualties that the British had faced, and plus a lot of general loot, because that whole place, Delhi, as you know, was in those days the Mughal emperor, even as they say na, कि सवाल मरा हुआ हाथी भी सवाल आग का होता है, कि there was still a lot of treasure inside the Red Fort and with the nobility. So all that was looted. There was a prize committee that was made, etc., etc. And this book then talks about how on the 19th of September, when the king Bahadur Shah Zafar leaves the Qila, goes to Humayun's tomb, and then from there he's on 20th of September he's captured or abducted, as Sir has written in one of the books that it was the abduction of, so he is brought back and put in under house arrest. And the people of the residents of Lal Qila, Red Fort, that is again about 2,000-3,000 of them, start fleeing for their lives. Many of the the princes of the royal blood are killed. 30 of them are killed by Hudson, and the women all start to leave. They go in whichever way they can. Some go by cart, some go by like a walking. And this Khwaja Hasan Nizami, his grandfather was the Sajada Nashin of Hazrat Nizamuddin Auliya's Dargah at the time of 1857. And this is one of the sources that tells us that Bahadur Shah Zafar, when he left the Qila, went first to the Dargah and handed over the relics of the Prophet to the Sajada Nashin. And even today on Bara Wafat, that is the Prophet's birthday, those relics are put up for show for the people to come and do ziyarat. So this book talks of that. This book talks of many things which we come to know from this, especially about the king and what he faced after when he was leaving. And then the people of the fort decide to leave because they know now the British are in 20th also, they capture the Red Fort. And again, that chronology is written on the mutiny memorial, that 20th, the city was evacuated of the enemies. That is the inscription given by the British. And they went wherever they could. Many of them died. This question is often asked, why don't we know where are the survivors of the Mughal Empire or the descendants of the Mughal Emperor? They ran, so many of them had to hide their identity. And there's one story of Quresh. He was, in fact, the heir apparent Wali Ahad the, and he fled, and he was a very good sitar player. And he goes to the court of Udaipur, and there he lives as a kind of a jogi. And So nobody knows him. Only one day when somebody from Delhi comes, he's playing in the court of the Maharaja of Udaipur, and somebody recognizes and says, "Ki sirf Shehzada hi is tarah ka Sahib Alam sirf is tarah ka sitar baja sakte the." And then he of course says, like takes him into confidence and says that don't reveal my identity. So things like this is why we have no account of where so many of the survivors went, and many of them went to Hyderabad, and there is this one Prince Tusi who keeps coming up from there, like we have no idea whether he is or not, but he could possibly be, because we do not have the genealogy. Records were broken. I was just, records were all destroyed. I was just reading a book in which there was mentioned that 17,000 manuscripts were sold from the walled city of Shah Jahanabad, out of which 4,700 made their way to Britain. So all records were destroyed, genealogical records were destroyed. So today we find it very difficult to identify who could have been a descendant or a survivor of that Mughal empire. And this book gives us some into a glimpse into the life of the royals after 1857.
It's important to perhaps underline that this book which you have translated and which you have provided a sort of an edited annotations and brought it to a reading public which is not familiar with the Urdu language. I think it's important that we understand the significance of talking about the women of the family. There's so much that we have on what happened to the men. We know that many of the the able-bodied male adults, it was assumed that they would have been part of the rebel force. So, wherever they could be, whenever or wherever they could be captured, they were captured, put on trial, and sent off to, exile, transportation, and so on. But what happened to the women, I think that's a very important story. And I think Khwaja Hasan Nizami also needs to be sort of commended for having this sensitivity to focus on what was happening to the women of the family. Obviously, he would have heard stories, he might have been familiar with some of them in the city. I'm sure similar things obviously happened in Lucknow as well. But there was another point which you made, which I wanted to get back to, which is that, the problems which historians face, those who are social historians or economic historians, in dealing with a theme like 1857, particularly when it comes to looking at the military aspects of the entire conflict, because ultimately it was a military conflict. The Sipahis, as well as the British army, the company's troops, European troops, they all were engaged in a fierce military conflict, and it becomes a problem. And I must congratulate the USI and Rana Safvi for taking the initiative to educate us a little more about the military aspects of history, and in this context 1857. I mean, this is a problem which I myself has often faced. I've taught on 1857 for a long time, but this was where I always had serious problems understanding many of these military aspects. And one of the books which I found extremely useful for understanding what happened at Lucknow was a memoir written relatively late in the 19th century, Forbes Mitchell's memoir of the military conflict. And that was one account which really gave me a very good idea about the final stage of that conflict and how fierce that conflict was, and made me also sort of understand, with whatever limited understanding I have of military issues, is that the end game was something that was beyond the rebels. So that's where the training of someone like Colin Campbell, he really knew, what to do when it comes to, finishing off the rebels. When they are trapped in that big sort of area, and, the use of the bayonet, which he says, you must go and use your bayonet. So, those are things which come out so vividly. So, if you could sort of help us understand a little more about, the problems which the absence of an officer cadre trained in some of these aspects would have had, in terms of the outcome of 1857 in Lucknow.
Yes, it's interesting that you mention the book by Forbes Mitchell, because this is practically the only account written by a sergeant, a non-commissioned officer, and he's obviously got a very different view from the usual memoirs by Campbell and Outram and that kind of thing. And that's why it was a valuable book. And he is the only person to mention the African woman who was shot down from a tree in Secunderabad. This was a walled enclosure, and this is where the greatest loss of life among Indians took place. About 2,000 men were massacred. They put themselves in a way in a kind of trap because they didn't think the British company soldiers would actually get into this walled enclosure. They were wrong. In fact, the British deployed cannons to actually punch a hole through the wall, and once the hole was there, then the troops, of course, went in, and somebody opened the main gate to let in the rest of the troops. But the interesting thing is that once the British were inside, and it's true they were using their bayonets as well as their rifles, a number of them dropped dead, quite a substantial number found to be dropping to the ground under a very large tree. And they figured out that somebody was up the tree shooting down at the British. So naturally they shot up into the tree, and the body of a woman fell down, and as she fell, her blouse sort of came loose, so they could see she was a woman. But what is most interesting is that she was an African woman, and she was part of the bodyguard of the last Nawab, Wajid Ali Shah, who actually had a fondness for African women. He says this quite up front in his autobiography. And so he'd got a number of African women who probably were brought, I think, one generation ago as slaves. We know there was a very substantial slave trade between Africa, brought in by Arab slave traders, brought in to Mumbai, and then filtered out across northern India. It was mainly Muslim kingdoms that would employ African slaves. So this African woman, we don't know her name, but she was up there with a rifle. She was a very, very good shot indeed. About 40 years ago, there was a statue of the unknown woman in Secunderabad, and that was fair enough. She was, portrayed as fair-skinned, but it was obviously referring to the African woman. Over the years, I'm sorry to say, a myth has grown up that she was actually a Dalit woman called Uda Devi, who was fighting against the British. And I'm often asked, tell me about Uda Devi, and I say she's a construct. She wasn't real. It was an African woman. What were the other points you raised? I got carried away by Forbes Mitchell.
The difficulties which a social historian, or historian of architecture, or even economic historian faces in trying to talk about military conflict.
As I said, I had to get a briefing from a retired brigadier, and I'm sure there are a number of mistakes in this. But one thing I would say, that the Battle of Chinhut was the only battle which was actually fought on something that looked like a battlefield. It was fought on open ground. And for the remainder of the events, it's actually in streets that you can recognize. It's crossing the River Gumpti by the Charbagh Bridge, and it all becomes very, very urban. And in some cases, we know that battles were fought not only from street to street, but from building to building, and even from room to room, because once the British punched their way into the old Begum Koti on Hazratganj, they're literally fighting room to room. It's dark, people are throwing grenades and gunpowders set alight, all kinds of things. And at the end of that particular conflict, there's a whole huge pile of slaughtered Indians. Their clothes are on fire from the smoke. So, as I say, it becomes very, very urban indeed. And for those of you who know Lucknow, we're talking about buildings which still stand today. The September Imambara in Hazratganj, for example. Again, the wall was punched in. And Kaisabag, which was the main palace built recently by Wajid Ali Shah, again, we can trace the forces flowing between the gates, the main gates which still are there, and being shot at from the terraces, which again are still there. So it's actually quite easy to recreate what happened if you know the buildings, and a surprising number of them still exist. Obviously the residency does, but the residency was not actually the site of battles itself, because the troops surrounding it and firing into it didn't actually manage to get in. There were one or two sort of very dodgy incidents, and there was also mining going on underneath the residency into the hill itself. But again, that didn't actually penetrate. So the residency remained, but as I say, it becomes very urban, and once you know the streets and the buildings, you can actually trace the progress of the British coming in and the Indians gradually retreating. So perhaps it wasn't quite as difficult as one would imagine, because it wasn't a sort of battlefield situation.
Thanks. Talking about buildings, over the years, since I was a graduate student, I've had several occasions to visit. I'm not very familiar with Lucknow, but the residency is one place which continues to sort of fascinate me, and I've been there several times. It's only recently that I realized that one needs to sort of have a look at some of the other buildings which which still survive and survive in a very good state. So a couple of years back, I went to Lucknow, and I started my journey with Dilkusha. So that gave me a kind of perspective of the way in which the British troops would have started approaching the city. So Dilkusha in relation to the residency is something which I didn't have any sort of understanding of, though the topography has changed a bit, but one's knowledge is derived entirely from looking at maps. But when you actually go there and you look at Dilkusha, then you realize what significance that might have had in the final sort of operations for the recapture of the city. So thank you so much. Now, coming back again to Delhi, there's one point which I'd like to make, but perhaps a little later. But before that, since again talking about women, and you rightly pointed out that given the fact that it became so, the way in which the royal family was targeted after 1857, they, wherever possible, they just went sort of underground, and even after several decades, they were very reluctant to reveal their identities. But many of these women continue to command a great deal of respect. And I'm reminded of when you were talking about these women and their dispersal and what was happening to them, of a remark which C.F. Andrews makes in his very charming sort of little memoir of Munshi Zakaullah, where he says, of course, Munshi Zakaullah's family had connections with the palace. His father was tutor to princes, and he talks about how, and this is early, first decade of the 20th century, where he's talking of how the kind of respect which Munshi Zakaullah continued to have for women of Bahadur Shah's family. So apparently there was a room which was sort of specially reserved for one of them whenever she came to their residence. That was the room that that's the guest room that she was given. And he points out how, how reverential he was in his sort of the way he bowed to her and the way he treated her. So I think, that kind of, although Munshi Zakaullah in his writings is fairly sort of contemptuous of Bahadur Shah himself, but he has a very different kind of attitude to the women of the family. So I think, that's something which perhaps a book like the Begums really sort of helps us to understand the distinct identity which women of the family had in relation to the social, cultural life of the city.
One thing that comes across from this book is the resilience. That all of them, they take it in their stride. It's the younger girls who are grumbling that, now we have to walk, we used to be carried in palkis. And the ladies and the mothers, etc., they're all very matter of fact about it. Okay, that was then, this is now, we have to now make our living. And in a few of the stories, like one story which is something that I really found very fascinating was about Dara Bakht's, Mirza Dara Bakht's daughter, Gul, and Gul Bano, and that it starts with her lifestyle before September 1857 and then goes on to how she died and was, like she's then imagining in the end, she's, in the Dargah of Hazrat Chiragh, Delhi, it's raining, and she is very cold, it's the winters, and she's then remembering how today she's covered by a sackcloth, and in those days it would be gold and silver brocade covers and sheets, and how the singers would come to wake her up, and the mother keeps on trying to tell her that, you have to brace yourself, you have to, adapt to circumstances. So that kind of contrast also comes through. The women are all very tough. It's the younger ones who suffer. And even one story, two stories in fact, of young princesses. One is captured and taken to Kanpur, another is captured by some Ghosis in Gurgaon. And they very matter-of-factly write that, okay, we were married to the son of the Ghosi, or I was married to so-and-so, etc. I was cooking rotis in so-and-so's house. So there's a lot of, acceptance of what has happened to them. That as a, one of the stories in this is also Bahadur Shah Zafar, who, when he goes to the Dargah and he says that we had also captured power from somebody has captured from us now. So that kind of resignation and faith and resilience, that is something that comes through from of these women. And those Begum Zinat Mahal is not talked about in this book because she's not part of that. But Zahir Dehlvi talks about her and how much power she had. And I was reading a book, Sayyid Mehdi Hassan's book on Bahadur Shah Zafar, where he talks of in one place where money is needed, it's Zinat Mahal who comes and gives the money. So it's not that the women were not powerful, they did have a lot of power, but it's just, I think that it was like all the other Mughal women that they have never been written about. And we have to just look for sources to find them. One of this is this, but of course there are a lot of Persian sources from which we can read about the women of the Mughal Empire.
There's an important connection, I think, which we need to recognize between what was happening in Delhi and what was happening in Lucknow, because once Delhi had been recaptured, it became possible for many of those who were engaged in the operations in Delhi they were sent to Haryana, of course, but they were also sent to Lucknow. And one name, of course, is important there, which was Hodgson. And so there were those who took their experience to Lucknow. But I've always found it sort of really sort of interesting that they give that the distance between Kanpur and Lucknow is just about what, 80 kilometers?
Yes.
Yeah. And yet it took such a long time for the British to recapture Lucknow. And in fact, the kind of resistance they encountered in the villages between Kanpur and Lucknow was also a bit of a problem for them. So I was wondering if you'd like to sort of comment on this, the difficulties that they encountered sitting just sort of 80 kilometers from Lucknow and yet unable to...
Yes, well, as you probably know, General Havelock had to make 3 attempts to get to Lucknow from Kanpur, and he was opposed. He had to turn back on 3 separate occasions. It was only on the 4th that he managed to get to Lucknow, so there was fierce opposition. There are obviously problems with the weather as well, because we're in the monsoon season now. But you're absolutely right. But also with the fall of Delhi, if you want to call it the fall, or the recapture, you not only free up British and Indian sepoys loyal to the British, but you also release a large number of the opposition who then come to Lucknow. So they're actually boosting the opposition forces in Lucknow. So it works both ways. Hodson is an interesting case, as you said. He was responsible not only for the deaths of 2 of the emperor's sons, but also something that's often overlooked, were the bandsmen accompanying them. There were 24 Anglo-Indian bandsmen who had gone down to the tomb with the emperor and his party. They were also killed. Hodson's defense was that he thought if he didn't strike, he himself might be in danger, and this was refuted by his ADC. One thing that intrigues me is that it's said Hodson, as you know, was killed in Lucknow. He was actually killed in the Begum Koti on Hazratganj. Some people say he was killed while looting. This was something else that one could talk about. But I've also come across now accounts saying it was Begum Hazrat Mahal who offered a prize, a money prize, to the person who would shoot Hodson. Now this sounds much more plausible to me. I think Hodson was picked off. He was an experienced officer. I think he was deliberately killed at the instigation of Begum Hazrat Mahal. And I think just to finish this, Hodson was taken to Banks Bungalow. He died the next day from his injuries. And he was buried in the grounds of La Martinière, the big famous school built by Claude Martin. His tomb is still there. I saw it last week. But what really intrigues me is that every year, members of Hodson's horse, I know the regiments have all been merged, but nevertheless, there is a ceremony at Hodson's tomb where members of Hodson's horse in uniform stand there, and there are bugle parades and a commemoration of Hodson. Now, this does say something to me about mixed messages, tolerance, if you like. The murderer of the emperor's sons is still celebrated today in Lucknow by Indian soldiers. Make of that what you will.
But since we are talking of Hodson, and if I'm not wrong, he's perhaps among the most notorious British officers in the context of Delhi. I was just wondering if Rana Safvi Sahiba would have something to say on Hodson and her sort of how to sort of assess his
To carry on from what Rosie mentioned about Hudson and Hudson House coming, I studied in La Martiniere. One of the houses, school houses of La Martiniere was called Hudson, and I was in that. So growing up, we had no idea who this Hudson was. We only knew that we have four houses: Cornwallis, Hudson, Martin, and I've forgotten the fourth. Cornwallis, Hudson, Martin, and Leon's. So these were the four houses, and I was in Hudson. So we never knew who this Hudson was. It's only when I started reading about 1857 that I came to know who Hudson was. And yes, he is very notorious. And in fact, the one thing that in Zahir Dehlvi's book, Zahir does not mention Hudson. He says Saunders is the one who did all that. And again, because of maybe Zahir Dehlvi's family being in touch, being employed by Rajab Ali, and Rajab Ali being close to Hudson, all these were, like so many wheels within wheels, as they would say, that, and Hudson, in Khwaja Hasan Nizami's another book called Dilli Ki Jankuni, that is the one where you have a very graphic account of what Hudson did. And there's also a very, a fanciful account, I would say, I don't know whether it's true or not, that Khwaja Hasan Nizami says that Hudson drank a sip from Mirza Mughal's blood because he said he is the one who was responsible for so many deaths, especially the 56 people who were killed on the 16th of May inside the fort, the British women and children who were killed. So that is something that weighed heavily against Bahadur Shah Zafar also during his trial, and that is something for which they did seek to revenge. And so this is a very fanciful account, but as I said, the most graphic account of Hudson is in Dilli Ki Jankuni. And I'm in the process these days of translating that.
Now, since we have just a couple of minutes left, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. We'll take a couple of them and request our speakers to respond. So, any questions or comments or observations on 1857, Lucknow or Delhi?
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I'm afraid I had to keep flitting in and out, so I caught only snatches of it. There's a very interesting question, and that is on the so-called trial of Bahadur Shah Zafar, right? Would any of you three distinguished historians like to comment on the legality of the subjects trying a sovereign? Does it hold ground?
I can't hear, I'm afraid. I'm very deaf.
On the trial of Bahadur Shah Zafar.
Yes.
On the legality or otherwise of Bahadur Shah's trial?
I can't really answer that. It's not something I've studied in depth, but I think that's more your question than mine.
When Bahadur Shah was tried, the munadi or the proclamation that was done was Khalq Khuda ki, Mulk Badshah ka, Hukum Company ka. So jab Mulk Badshah ka tha, so how could he be tried for sedition? So there was, and he was in shock. He's, as you can see from that propaganda photograph that, makes the rounds every year during the time of the uprising, that he does not even look in his right mind. And most of the description, as you talked about that Mr. Pramod Kapoor's book on the trial of Bahadur Shah, the description of is a man who is not, in his senses. And I don't even think his legal team was aware of what was happening, and they were all under just a lot of shock. But that did not have, the legality of it is definitely dubious, because he can't be tried for sedition against his own empire.
Very important point. Just very quickly to add to this, way back in 1922, a scholar by the name of F.W. Buckler wrote a very lengthy essay on the political theory of the Indian mutiny, which actually looks at the legality of the trial itself. So the point that he was making, Buckler was making, and this was something 1920s, it was very difficult to write a thing like that. The point is whether, as somebody who's recognized as sovereign in terms of international law by the East India Company can be tried in terms of, that. Ranchina sir, in fact, now there's some interesting work which is being done on the issue of martial law. So what is the kind of martial law which was being applied in trying not just Bahadur Shah but the various military commissions which were set up in 1857-58 to try the rebels. So maybe, but this is a very sort of significant question. I think, it's something which is receiving a lot of attention now, in terms of international law, issues of sovereignty and so on.
The first is regarding the Mughals having got lost. So I was talking to the last Nawab of Meerut, who's no more sadly, Nawab Afzal Muhammad Khan. So he told me of the story of a Mughal who never married and lived in Meerut city, and he gave him his Sazra, printed copy, which one I have with me, tracing a descent directly from Temur Lang. And he said he used to never meet anyone, he used to stay aloof in his house, but because of my father, he used to come to my father and meet him and go back to his house. And subsequently I tried to search for any Mughal descendants in that region, because immediately they would have run there. So I could find only one family after that. So probably they escaped east or other directions and just hid their caste identities also, probably to hide themselves. Second is regarding women participation. I have this newspaper illustrated on the news, and in that they say that during one of those charges from Shahjahanabad towards the ridge, there is a person on a charger who is very brightly dressed. And when they catch her, they find that she is a woman. So that's also...
That story is there in the Begmat
Really?
Kasu. She's called a green-clad woman.
I have the original
there in this
newspaper
book.
clipping, so I've got the whole collection. So in that, and I was so very fascinated about that story. Third point, which is a question actually, and which is raised for the past so many years in our city, is Bahadur Shah Zafar, before being taken to Rangoon, was brought to Meerut and kept in a building. Now there is a building there in the cantonment which has a mosque, which has a inscription, Persian inscription, which has still to be translated. I've got the photograph. And every unit which came to Meerut all these years would be told that Bahadur Shah Zafar was kept here. But no written record has been traced to that building. So is there an account of how Bahadur Shah Zafar was day to day taken after his trial from Delhi all the way to Rangoon?
I can just talk about that green lady. Maybe Hudson was involved in that also, because Hudson got her captured and sent to Ludhiana and Ambala. He sent her to Ambala. And he called her Joan of Arc, Indian Joan of Arc.
Yeah, but frankly, I have not come across this reference, but I don't rule this out, because several months elapsed between Bahadur Shah's being sentenced and his actual transportation. So, I mean, it's plausible, but I don't really think that as of now we have any reference easily available to that. Perhaps we could look at that. But there are accounts actually of, because it was only a couple of months later, after he had been sentenced to transportation, that the Governor General issued the order for transportation to Rangoon. So the trial itself ended with his conviction and sentenced to transportation, but the place of transportation was something which was decided several months later. I think we should also keep in mind the fact that this overlapped with the major and the military operations against the rebels, which actually took place from around March till the monsoon of 1858. So it's only after that that Bahadur Shah is taken to Rangoon. So maybe just one very brief comment or observation if somebody has. Otherwise, yeah.
I have one question. Like if we are talking about that 1857 siege of Kanpur specifically, as we know that Jallianwala Bagh was a massacre which got popularized, but at the same time in 1857 around in Kanpur, there was one Colonel Neil who hanged around 133 people on a banyan tree, but that is still, you can say, unheard, or it is not that much covered. So what is your comment about it, that why it is not coming up in the way what Jallianwala Bagh did?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Like to know is, why is it that we don't have enough sort of spotlight on what Neil did at Kanpur or on his way to Kanpur?
Sorry, who did? Havelock?
Neil.
Oh, Neil.
Yeah,
Neil was a really nasty piece of work. I can't comment in detail on Kanpur. This isn't quite my field, but obviously because it's near Lucknow, there are, coincidences. I think Neil actually has been seen in a very bad light more recently. William Dalrymple, for example, called him an absolute psychopath. I think his crimes are being recognized. Kanpur, if you like, was a sort of counterpart to Lucknow. It was in Kanpur that the British were not only defeated but massacred, whereas in Lucknow they somehow survived triumphantly. So it's always useful to look at the two together, but I must admit that they are often separated. And in fact, this is the case with this book. I'm dealing almost entirely with Lucknow, whereas my colleague Andrew Ward in America has dealt almost entirely with Kanpur, and it's perhaps time we put the two together. But I do take your point about Neil.
Conclude the session. We thank our speakers for enlightening us about their books and about some aspects of 1857 which haven't really received much attention in the huge amount of literature which exists on 1857. And I would like to thank the organizers, the audience, for a very fine session. Thank you very much.